I'll just make 2 points. As a lifelong maniacal, rabid Indiana alumni and fan, as a lifetime maniacal Indiana fan and alumni, I greatly enjoyed the 80s when we were frequently beating up on the Badgers. But you guys have gotten us back the past couple of years.
Here, can you move the microphone
Sorry, is
down?
the microphone not working?
Yeah, it just needs to move it down a little bit.
I'm also very short.
Thank you.
I'll skip the joke.
No, don't skip the joke.
I just wanted to clarify your point about the SSRIs, and just want to make clear that there's been, when the original reports came out that led to the black box warnings on the SSRIs, on Prozac and Paxil, it was front page news, it was all over the place. Although the studies clearly said there was not a single percentage point of increase in actual completed suicide, nor even suicidal behavior. There was a slight increase that was documented in some suicidal thoughts, but they didn't do a very good job of pulling out what those kids were like beforehand, before the SSRIs. The more recent research that's come out has shown that there has been a skyrocketing increase, a significant increase in completed suicides and suicide attempts since those black box warnings have gone on. And that news has been, buried on page 20 of most of the newspapers and is not out there. I think most mental health practitioners are aware of that, but a lot of the general public is not aware of that.
Well, I was on the FDA panel that recommended the black box warning, so I saw all the raw data and heard all the discussions. And my understanding of it was slightly different. Number one, SSRIs certainly reduce the risk of suicide in some depressed adults and children. They also increase the risk of suicide in some others. That is this so-called activation syndrome, which leads some depressed people to suddenly do something about it, almost always within a week or so after starting these drugs, also happens. So there seemed to be a net reduction in completed suicides following the widespread use of SSRIs, and the black box warning seemed to have been associated with an increase in suicides, because they do effectively treat depression. Little side comment, Prozac effectively treats depression in adolescents. 7 other SSRIs, 25 studies in adolescents, none of them showed an advantage over placebo in treatment of adolescent depression. So that's another issue, and that was the reason for the black box warning for these other non-Prozac drugs. That is, this risk seemed very real, and there seemed to be no benefit for the non-Prozac SSRIs. So I agree with you that availability of SSRIs has improved the suicide rate overall, and the recommendation of the intent of the black box warning was not to stop their prescription, but to have practitioners who prescribe them, which were generally not psychiatrists, and parents, to be very attentive to this risk of suicidal behavior within the first few weeks after their use. The idea was not to discourage their use, but to just make sure they were indicated, to prefer Prozac, and to monitor the children more effectively.
Any others? Yes.
So I had 2 questions actually about your take on coercion. The first being that specifically in adolescence, you have parents. And so student athletes or adolescent athletes are not acting independently, they're acting and they have a parent. Do you have any concerns about the potential of coercion by parents in an environment where suddenly these drugs are legal, that the child might not in fact be consenting to the treatments, but might in fact have them imposed on them? And then my second question, I'm sorry, I know you were speaking specifically about steroids in American sports, but having a little bit more familiarity with blood doping and cycling, there now appears pretty good evidence that in the late 90s, the German Deutsche Telekom team was in fact requiring their riders to participate in blood doping. And regardless of their performances, if they chose not to, those are the ones who tended to not have their contracts renewed, even if they had fairly decent results. If they did not participate in the organized blood doping, they seemed to be on different teams the following year. And I wonder if there's any level that if this became legal, that might meet your definition of coercion.
Well, with regard to the first point, there are many ways parents can be abusive of their children or be bad parents. And one of them, surely, is to force, pressure their children to engage in dangerous activities or activities that the child doesn't want and that are either physically dangerous or emotionally dangerous. Obviously, parents don't need to use steroids or encourage their children to use steroids to do that. But parents who pressure their kids to be the star quarterback on the team or the best gymnast in the state and so on, I think are problematic. As someone who's been working in child abuse for 35 years also and seen thousands of abused children, the number of parents who do that sort of thing far exceeds the number who use steroids or tell their kids to use steroids or even whose kids. So I think that kind of parenting is a problem, and pediatricians and others should be alert for it and try to be helpful to parents and children who get caught up in that. I agree that parents who get caught up in that sort of thing may pressure their kids or make their kids more likely to use performance-enhancing drugs that might be dangerous, and that's not good. So, but I think the basic problem is the parenting, not the steroid. Steroid may be an added part of it. And by the way, I'm against steroid use in minors in general. Where that boundary comes is obviously going to be very imprecise, but I wouldn't object to a complete prohibition under 18 just because it's administratively easier to do it that way, and you could test in the schools. Your second question about the blood doping, I would not agree that that telling the bicyclist, a competent adult, clearly over 18 bicyclist, that unless he or she, he in this case, takes EPO, which is I guess what you're talking about, that he's off the team. I don't see that as being coercive. First of all, biking, as we all know, is an incredibly dangerous sport all on its own. If adding to the danger by taking EPO adds to the danger, then that's something that a bicyclist needs to take into account and decide whether this is the sport for him and wants to walk away from it. I could add or her because Connie Carpenter was alleged to have been using these drugs also, the great American female cyclist. As I mentioned, athletes discovered 20 years ago that training at altitude can accomplish the same thing almost with also danger, and now hypobaric chambers, which are ubiquitous. The American training facility for the speed skaters, which is in West Allis, Wisconsin, just outside of Milwaukee, was built with a hypobaric chamber in it, whose sole purpose is to jack up your hemoglobin to levels that might be dangerous. So if you're worried about the effect of hypercoagulable blood from and hypertension from excessive blood viscosity from jacking up your hemoglobin, then high hemoglobins is what should be regulated. That is, the Tour de France or the Olympics should have a rule saying anyone with a hemoglobin over 15 or wherever the danger level is can't compete. It would be a much cheaper screening system and a much more effective one. But that should be what the target is, not this silly distinction between whether you take EPO or whether you train at altitude or sleep in a hypobaric chamber or take a gene insertion, which is now on the horizon to achieve the same result. So I don't think any of these temptations are coercive. I think they're temptations, and people who want to be rich and famous take on very, very severe risks to do so. They're not forced. I don't know of any examples of anyone who's forced into doing it.
Dr. Sober?
Yeah, I liked very much your presentation, and especially because it helps people, and especially kids that are interested in this, and reflect in terms of societal contradictions, hypocrisy, and so on. However, as one concern that I have, which is if this now would change overnight, let's say somebody in a group of people in these sports organizations find that you're right and we have to change it all, what one would be launching would be a tremendous experiment. And so my thought is that another element to be considered in this list that you made is the element of prudency. This is kind of like an experiment. We really don't know what's going to happen over time. We don't know what the possibility for coercion would be when there's a lot of money involved. it could very well be that in one way or another, those that don't do this fall below whatever is expected and will be fired. So that eventually there would be an enormous number of people who will be taking this for a long time with societal approval. It will inevitably increase the rank of teens that are already using it. So shouldn't there be some kind of transition or study or different approach than simply stating this is wrong and it should now be available? And I'm thinking in terms of something like graduated licensing for teenagers, or all the limitation of drinking alcohol below the age of 18. Of course, people don't adhere to those things, but the amount of damage that is involved with this prudential attitude is much less than if it would be totally permissible to start drinking at age 15 or whatever the similarity would be.
Tom, you're talking just about adolescents now, not about clearly competent adults.
Well, I'm thinking that it trickles down to adolescents. No, I'm talking about in general that one thing is the theory and another thing is the practice of what would happen if this would be totally permissible all of a sudden in our sports societies and groups at this point in time. It's perhaps a theoretical thing, but my idea is that we really don't know the bad things that can happen if this gets turned briskly or suddenly turned around. On the one hand, we have hypocrisy, and on the other hand, we have an unknown. And the principle of prudency is what I'm advocating.
Well, a couple comments. First, we do know what happens, and not much happens. That is, steroids have been used by tens of millions of people over the last 30 years. It's more common in bodybuilding than in competitive sports. There are millions upon millions of bodybuilders who use these things, and while there aren't systematic studies, there hasn't been any great epidemic of heart attacks, strokes, cancer, or any other problem in these bodybuilders. I mean, they're well known, they're in gyms, and it's all anecdotal, but if there was some tremendous risk, like Gary Wilder and other claims, it seems to me we would have known something about it after 30 years of widespread use. And we certainly know many, many tens of thousands of athletes who have been using them. And again, I'd have trouble coming up with the name of a single athlete who's had a fatal consequence of steroids. I mean, there's the Taylor Hooton case, maybe, and one or two others. So the chances that there's some high incidence of some serious problem is low. But second, the part I'm not understanding is there are things that we do know are catastrophic, 1,000 times more catastrophic, like driving. And nobody suggests we should ban driving or ban teen driving. So I don't understand why we're even having a discussion about something that maybe causes a serious problem in a tiny percentage of people, maybe, when we have something that we know causes a very serious problem in huge numbers of people, not to mention, of course, smoking, which kills 400,000 people a year, most of whom started in adolescence. So I just don't understand why this has occupies so much of our news and congressional hearings and presidential State of the Union addresses, all of which have focused on steroids and not a word about all these things that we know are problems.
So Norm, I'm going to ask you a broader question, which is that, you know, and I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who, as you know, is a huge sports fan. But I begin from the premise that, in fact, we're driving this machine. I mean, whenever somebody gets killed in a football game, they show the instant replay over and over and over again. I mean, it's clear that the American people love to see blood on the field. And so the question that I would ask is, so assuming that, so let's take that steroids are not particularly harmful in the short term or in the longer term, but are there limits that you would put on the kinds of interventions that people could do to enhance their performance in sport? And then I would like you also to talk about enhancement in sports performance versus enhancement in academic in academic or intellectual performance. Where I think the debate is somewhat different about, getting a leg up. So I think your points about steroids are right on, and I totally get it. But I think the question that we have to ask is, are we really interested in creating a new gladiator group? What about the new data that suggests that students who go to college to play basketball can't make it in the NBA, and that if you really want to be a star in the NBA, you better go right out of high school, because if you go into college, you won't ever make it? I mean, there are a number of things that are just kind of fretful social that I would ask you to think about.
Well, three things you mentioned, Ellen. The first is there some level of catastrophe that even I would find unacceptable? If half the people who use steroids died the next morning after taking their first toll, do I think they should be prohibited? Yeah. Something that's causing, even though something that kills 400,000 people a year we don't regulate, and alcohol, which kills 50,000 a year, we don't regulate. So you'd have to at least say if it's no worse than those things, if only 400,000 people died a year from using steroids. But somehow we think that one death of steroids. So yeah, there's some number where it would be a problem, but you'd have to explain to me why the number for steroids should be a different number than the number for alcohol or tobacco, which has no socially.
I'll concede that.
Okay, so there's some level at which I'd be quite alarmed, and that's why I think the roughing the passer rule, for example, I would be in favor of changing that tomorrow morning because of the tremendous disability and permanent harm that results to people. The problem is, as you say, people want to see the blood on the field. The NFL would dry up and go away tomorrow if roughing the passer was the same as roughing the kicker. If there wasn't a chance of the quarterback really being carried off the field. So yeah, there's some level of death and destruction that I would find a sufficient basis for, but you'd have to explain to me why that should be a lower number than other things that we tolerate. Your second thing about performance enhancement in the schools, Ritalin, of course, and Adderall and other stimulants are now ubiquitously used by students at all levels, high school, middle school, college, and above. I don't think there's anything immoral about trying to enhance your academic performance if it helps you do that. I don't know yet that there's any serious wide public health problem from the use of these drugs, but if there is, then I think we ought to take a look at it as we do for any other drugs. So, but I don't think there's anything immoral in somebody trying to enhance their academic performance by using a stimulant or any of the other ways in which people enhance their academic performance. Your third thing about youngsters now being going directly into competitive elite sports right out of high school and younger, as others have written more eloquently than I, the hypocrisy here is quite amazing. So, for example, and seems to be racially tinged. So tennis players have been starting on the tour at age 15, baseball players at 16, 17. Baseball players almost never go to college. And nobody ever thought that was some sort of great moral crisis because they, in the past, were mostly white people. But when black athletes want to join the NBA right out of high school, what baseball players have been doing for 100 years, somehow this is considered some great moral crisis and some great social crisis that people aren't going to college. So I think we need to have some consistency. If we want to say you have to go to college for 3 years to play Major League Baseball, I don't hear any great argument for that. But absent that, I don't see any reason for prohibiting a kid in high school or who hasn't even graduated from high school from going to make his fortune in Europe or in the NBA any more than baseball players do, or track and field stars or gymnasts or anybody else. There's a big white-black disparity. It's interesting how it's just when black basketball players started to doing it that people began to get very upset about it.
Oh, don't you remember how provoked people were when John McEnroe dropped out of Stanford to go pro?
Stanford alumni were provoked.
On that note, we're at 3:30. Let's thank our speakers for the day.